Well, joining us this morning is a very special guest. He's just been appointed the chairperson of a committee that will look at the possibility of overhauling the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, or the FRBM. Remember, this was something that the government spoke about in the budget. The finance minister articulated the need for perhaps overhauling the FRBM in his budget speech. It was also borne out in the economic survey. Mr. N.K. Singh, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. I don't want to get you to prejudge this issue, because I know that this is a matter that is now being deliberated on by the committee that you head. You have until October the 31st to present your recommendations. So I'm going to ask you this purely in an academic realm, because these are concerns and issues that have been raised with the FRBM, sir. Let me ask you about the meeting that was held over the weekend. That was the first meeting of the FRBM panel. Was that essentially to sort of suss out the terms of reference that the government has given you?
Well, it was a preliminary meeting where we wanted to discuss the roadmap, the contours, the procedures of work. It was largely housekeeping kind of activities, which is to be expected in the first meeting. But we did go into some of the issues and which are in public domain, so there is no great secret. The debate which has raised not only in India, the debate has been raised all over the world. And also, who are the kind of people with whom consultation should be taken. This is the issue on which there are a large number of stakeholders,
right?
Not the smallest of which are state governments, because state governments are very keenly watching what are the kinds of rules of the game that the central government prescribes for itself, and whether the same would be applicable to them or not.
Absolutely. In fact, on that point, you preempted my next question, because the former Deputy Chairperson of the Planning Commission, Singh, in a piece that he wrote on the need to overhaul the FRBM, had said that the FRBM Act succeeded in disciplining states because states can't borrow without the centre's permission, but it was spectacularly ineffective in disciplining the centre. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know whether it was spectacular or not, but Montague was very much a party to whatever was done.
That's absolutely right.
So for the 10 years in which he headed the Planning Commission, the part of the culpability really rests also on the doorsteps not of his personally, but the time, for instance, when Mr. Chidambaram pressed the pause button in wanting to augment the gross budgetary support of the government to support expenditure, and that Vijay Kelkar did a second Kelkar 2, so to say. Kelkar 1 was largely the implementational mechanism for the FRBM Act that the Parliament had enacted. But the Kelkar 2 was to revise the roadmap, which was prescribed in Kelkar 1. So I think that if the central government brought more flexibility with itself, that they were very much a partner with it. And that it is true, however, that state governments really felt that while the central government has brought flexibility, the states have been straitjacketed.
So since we're talking about states, let me ask you this in the context of what has been recommended by the 14th Finance Commission as well, and what that would then mean in the context of the new FRBM, so to speak. I mean, how do you apportion what the centre bears, what the state bears, also keeping in mind the combined fiscal deficit?
Well, I think one of the terms of reference of this FRBM committee, if you look at the terms of reference, it is talking of the finances of the government as a whole, which means the union and the states. So without specifically referring to the states, it does imply that the implications in respect of states need to be factored in any recommendations which are made. And to some extent, yes, you are right that the rules of the game and the overall milieu has been dramatically altered by the recommendation to the 14th Finance Commission, not only in terms of much larger devolution to 10% higher devolution from 32 to 42 is a very large number in absolute terms, but what happens to really the central support mechanisms for centrally sponsored schemes for many activities which are exceedingly important. It is quite curious that many states have really brought it to the Prime Minister's notice that they do not have money to, for instance, do the Sarvse Saksha Bhan on health issues and some of these issues, which is curious because they have got a significantly higher devolution in absolute terms, and that you cannot have really both. You cannot have a much higher devolution and not being and still wanting to depend. But anyway, the fact remains that we have traversed a big distance from the time when state governments were really seeking the Reserve Bank support for overdrafts. From there, this particular thing of imposing fiscal deficit constraints and the fiscal constraints and moving towards fiscal rectitude by the states has something repaired the states' finances very, very significantly. But how much of borrowing they can do for supporting their infrastructure from out of the internal resources, because don't forget that in addition to this, the state governments also have public sector undertakings, many of which are run very inefficiently. And I think particularly in respect of power sector, I think the efforts of the Power Minister, Mr. Goyal, at repairing the finances of the power sector of the states has been a significant and a quantum shift in the way in which the power sector finances are being managed. But these all need to be factored, that how is the state's borrowing needs to be accommodated along with a degree of fiscal discipline which will be consistent with the overall framework, and that therefore the central and the state governments need to act in tandem and in harmony.
So the states will be large stakeholders as part of the consultation process when your committee sits and deliberates.
By all means, we certainly will be consulting the states. They are an important stakeholder in any of these conclusions or recommendations that you want to make, and we will certainly be consulting them, state governments, in a significant way, and there is no doubt that their views would really be given. I mean, after all, it is this government's one of the high priority to move over to both cooperative and competitive federalism, and that the Prime Minister keeps one of his big mantras is Team India. And Team India is totally, you cannot have a Team India without the states being part of that Team India.
You're absolutely right. Let me ask you about one of the other issues that's being discussed and debated. In fact, the Finance Minister publicly stated in his budget speech as well that should there be a prescribed number for the fiscal deficit? Does it constrain the government or does the government need a little degree of flexibility, especially given the volatile and dynamic times that we live in? What would you suggest?
Well, I haven't applied my mind on this issue in terms of what the committee's deliberations are going to be, whether you need to have a number or a range or a set of numbers. But I think that the fact remains that ever since this act was enacted, the global contours have changed very dramatically. For instance, one of the principal entities which has always stood for very tight fiscal policies has been the International Monetary Fund.
That's right.
The International Monetary Fund is now consciously moving towards an accommodative fiscal policy. Look at what is happening to interest rates. I mean, countries far from quantitative easing are now going into negative interest rates.
Right.
You're talking in terms of helicopter money. You're talking of large number of countries which are suffering consequences of an aging population, where demand is and consumption needs are not a high priority. But the rules of the game for which need to be now seen is in the light of the fundamental changes on the whole global contour, in which number of new issues have come up ever since this act was initially crafted. Those certainly would be factored which would deserve the committee's consideration.
So beyond the global factors that the committee will need to look into, what about the domestic factors? And one of the big issues that continues to weigh on the economy and continues to weigh on public finances, of course, is the subsidy mechanism and the need for greater subsidy overhaul. How much of that is going to be something that the committee is going to look into? Because, given our tax to GDP ratio, the tendency so far really has been to cut down on capital expenditure, and that's really been a way of trying to achieve the fiscal deficit number. So how much of the subsidy overhaul is going to be, or improving the tax to GDP ratio is going to be something that the committee looks at?
Well, let me say that two or three very quick comments. I'll be brief. First, I think that this government has done some fundamental changes in the administration of the subsidy. I mean, the increasing use of the Aadhaar and the use of the technology platform, moving to a direct benefit taxes in terms of cash transfer, using mobile telephony for purposes of making the beneficiaries genuinely benefit, is a very fundamental change. The Prime Minister has mentioned about the enormous sums of money which have been saved on account of, for instance, the misuse of kerosene being minimized, on the way in which petroleum subsidies are going to be administered, the changes in the fertilizer subsidy regime in a very significant way. So subsidy rationalization has been a notable success of this government in the last 2 years, and improving the quality of governance in that regard. Having said this, I think that the problems which beset the Indian economy in terms of the fiscal thing must be seen in the broader context. Poverty continues to remain very high. More than that, I think that one factor which is really must be factored is that growth has not translated into employment opportunities. You have had 10 years of the previous UPA government, a decade of jobless growth, which is now well known. And so I think we need to not only focus on GDP numbers, need to focus on gainful employment opportunities. The bulk of these employment opportunities is in the informal sector. Methodology for the computation of employment data and the wide variations of employment coefficient, intersectoral employment coefficients, really make a policy prognosis more complex. But certainly we cannot look at growth without looking at employment. Credit numbers continue to dog us. The credit offtake continues to be very low. This is one of the unusual features of our growth trajectory. But I think that the more important thing is to certainly focus on quality of public intervention and quality of public expenditure into areas where gainful employment opportunities can be created, because that, I think, is one of our principal problems, that we need to create 12 million jobs a year. We need to, for instance, take care of the backlog of employment, and I think the focus of policy, in my view, must be increasingly becoming employment dominated.
Well, that's good to hear, because we actually, as you're absolutely right, while we talk a lot about this 12 million jobs that need to be added and so on and so forth, we actually haven't seen much work towards that. But let me ask you this as well, in terms of mobilization of higher taxes now. Compliance is one issue, and the government is trying to do its bit on that front. But any other innovative ideas to your mind that we could look at this point in time? Of course, the GST is still something that we're waiting for. Yeah.
GST, definitely, we have said it, is going to be a game changer. Even the most conservative estimates suggest that once that begins to get implemented, it will definitely improve the tax GDP ratio in a significant way. And I think as far as indirect taxes are concerned, clearly the early enactment of the GST is a path forward. Now, on direct taxes then, well, on direct taxes, I think attempts to enlarge the tax net has really competed with attempts to increase the threshold of exemptions. So, I mean, the overall fact remains that agriculture may be contributing a shrinking percentage of GDP, but it does give employment to a very high percentage of the overall Indian population. 55% of people, numbers vary, whether it could be 45, 55, but a very large percentage of people are still dependent on agriculture, and the agricultural sector is completely exempt from taxes. Now, certainly it would be very foolish to plead. First of all, that is in the domain of states. I think it would be foolish to plead that the income tax should be extended to agriculture. But look, for instance, the kind of anomalies which the finance minister has himself pointed out, or tax people have pointed out, that if you go on an average Diwali day, to find out where are the maximum number of Mercedes-Benz and Lamborghinis who are parked, you'll be quite surprised that it is on some towns in Punjab, and who's from agricultural income and all exempt from agricultural income. So what can be an innovative way of really, without hurting farmers in any way, or hurting farm incomes in any way, or of upturning what the manner of the distribution of the taxation range is, how does one really deal with this kind of a phenomena which leaves out a very large portion of the people outside the taxation network? Also, I think that if you look at the number of people who are paying taxes above 1 crore.
Yes.
It's a laughable number.
It is a laughable number.
And it's a shame for me to confess that I was the Revenue Secretary for several years when we did bring down the tax rate very, very significantly. But clearly, to be able for tax authorities to be able to see why such a minuscule number of people, everybody knows that the reality is the opposite, are really taxpayers of just about 1 crore, the total number.
So on that note, we are going to take a quick break, but when we return, we continue our conversation. It's a fascinating one with N.K. Singh. Come back to us on CNBC TV 18.